Thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I am so honored to be moderating this panel with these incredible authors and addressing a really important topic about kids who grieve and moving forward. I think it's particularly timely right now as we all seem to be collectively grieving events and situations here and abroad, but in addition to personal losses. So I really enjoyed each of your books. As a writer, I felt pangs of jealousy at moments when I had to pause and really appreciate a phrase or catch my breath because of how beautiful the writing was. So thank you for these beautiful books. I thought we could just start by each of you please giving a 1-minute introduction to your characters and the struggles that they're dealing with in each of your books, maybe beginning with Andrea.
Sure. So my most recent book, it's All or Nothing Vale, and it is about a competitive fencer. She is very much a perfectionist. She likes being good at fencing. And after she has an injury, she goes back to fencing only to realize that she's not competing at the same level she was before, which is really hard for her to reckon with. She very much has that it's all or nothing attitude. And so she has to really decide if she's okay with this new sort of identity she's taking on. How is she going to pivot, when her sense of self has suddenly completely irrevocably changed?
Excellent.
Hello, everyone. I will be talking about All the Blues in the Sky, which is a book about Sage, who is turning 13. She wants to be a pilot. She has big dreams of learning how to fly a plane. And as she deals with the grief of losing her best friend on her birthday, she realizes that if she can learn how to navigate all the blues in the sky, right, the stormy blue days, the bright blue skies that pilots have to learn how to fly through, maybe, just maybe, she can navigate the blues in her life. So she's learning how to hold deep sorrow and joy at the same time.
And I'm Kate, and my character Finn is the protagonist in The Trouble with Heroes. Finn is a kid who's had a rough 7th grade year. He is about to fail the grade, in fact, because he refuses to do what he calls the stupid poetry project. And he also is grieving the loss of his dad 2 years before the book begins. So on the Friday before Memorial Day weekend, he goes out and vandalizes a cemetery. He kicks over a gravestone that it turns out belonged to one of the first women to hike all 46 of the Adirondack high peaks. And when he gets caught on camera and dragged into court, the woman's daughter makes him this unusual offer. She says, look, you want to get out of trouble? I will drop all the charges. You don't even have to pay for the busted headstone if you can climb all 46 of these mountains in a single summer. And by the way, you have to bring my mother's dog, Seymour, with you. So this is the story of how Finn Connolly is sentenced to climb 46 mountains with a drooly, smelly dog that he does not like, at least not at first.
Awesome. And all of you chose to write these novels in verse. I know, Andrea, your first 2 novels were also verse novels, but Renee, you and Kate have, both written in poetry, but also in prose. And I wonder what drew you to write in verse for these novels. Was there a particular reason you chose to approach the stories that way? And also using the first person, were there particular challenges or advantages to writing this way? Maybe we can start with Renee this time.
So I think poetry lends itself to telling really big things in bite-sized pieces, and that felt right for a story about grief. I knew that there's some heavy moments in the book, so I wanted you all as readers to have a moment of pause and breath and reflection, and sometimes when there's a lot of words on a page, that can feel overwhelming. So you're already feeling the feels emotionally. I didn't want to put that extra pressure on you as a reader to have to deal with a lot of words. So there's something about the space on the page that I was just trying to take care of you all as readers. But then also thinking about the language of poetry and the potency of poetry. It feels very urgent, and there's something very urgent about grief that's very potent and strong. And so I thought that verse would be the best way to tell this particular story. And then also, I'm a poet at heart. Poetry is my first love. And so I've been wanting to write a novel in verse for a long time, and I just didn't have the right story yet. So this when Sage came to me with her story, I was like, yes, I think I can do it this time.
And you did it amazingly well. And thank you for those moments of pause, because I needed them. How about you, Andrea?
Yeah, I love poetry too. All my books have been in verse. But I think for Valentina's story especially, it felt very adequate to use poetry because she struggles with naming things a lot in this book. She has a hard time like naming her pain and explaining it to other people, because how do you explain something you're feeling internally and can't be like measured? She doesn't even realize that she is allowed to call what she's going through grief at first. You know, that we're allowed to feel grief for things that are not the death of a person, you know, and in this case, it's kind of the death of her old identity. And so poetry, I think, is a really good way to be able to explore things without using the words or to use alternative ways to say things. And so I think that really worked for Valentina because she herself doesn't have the words for what she's going through.
Yeah. Just to echo what Renee said too, I feel like verse leaves space for big feelings, right? That white space is a place to breathe, and it's a place, it's space for the feelings, right? And grief feels so enormous sometimes that felt like the right structure for this book. I'll be honest though, when I realized that this book was coming in verse, as opposed to Renee's first reaction, like, oh yes, this is it. My first reaction was, oh no, because I'd never written a novel in verse before. And so there's a 5-year gap between my last novel and this one. And part of the reason for that is because when I realized this was going to be in verse, I stepped back from writing it for a couple years to work on my craft as a poet so I could really do it justice. I mean, I've always written poetry, but never so much of it, and never as a whole novel. So.
And you approached it differently. Do you want to talk about that for a second? Like how you structured?
Sure. So I call this a novel in verse, parentheses, and other stuff, because this is the second novel that I've written that is actually multimodal, what we call, and it means that the story is told with not just text, regular narrative, but with other documents. So most of the story is in verse, but it's also told through letters, through text messages. There's some photographs. There are some other documents. There are choose your own disaster sequences. So it's a little interactive. But all of that really played into the themes for the book. And with my other book, Breakout, that's like this, what I found is that it's just really inviting to readers. That's how we experience our lives so much of the time, right? Through we might read a little bit, and then we've got this text message and this email, and it's just a really interesting way to engage with a story.
Yeah, I loved it. So we all know that anger is part of the grieving process and one of the stages. And I know all of your characters sort of experienced that in different ways and also entered into their grief in maybe a different place. And I thought it would be nice to hear how you take your readers through this journey and what you chose to focus on and why. Maybe starting with you, Andrea.
Yeah, Vale is very angry. She's very angry probably for the first half of the book. And that really comes out in how hard she pushes her body. She has been told pretty much all her life as a competitive athlete that pain is a necessary part of it. She has a saying she often quotes. She's like, pain is just weakness leaving the body. She very firmly believes that. And so she also believes anger is weakness. And so they kind of go hand in hand for her. And it's really not until she's able to kind of accept that maybe she doesn't want to be in pain all the time physically, that she's able to also let go of that pain emotionally and start to accept what she's feeling in other ways. But yeah, anger is a very, very big part of her journey.
Anger is a part of Sage's journey as well. She's thinking a lot about how to express the anger. She knows it's okay to have it, but she needs to learn a little bit about it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to be disrespectful. It's okay to be angry, but you also need to also be kind and listen to other people's stories. She's in a grief group and after school with other classmates who've had losses, and she's constantly comparing her loss to their loss. Well, you got to say goodbye. You knew it was coming. I did, and so she's jealous and angry at what she's dealing with. And there's a moment where she kind of just goes off on the class and has this big breakdown. And I wanted young people to know it is okay to be angry, and there are healthy ways to express that anger. And I don't know that we allow that, especially for girls, to say we're fine with their sadness and their tears and all the, but an angry girl, what can she do with that emotion and that rage? And so I was trying to also show readers ways to cope with anger, not trying to suppress it or ignore it, letting it be, but also letting it be in a way that's going to help you move forward and not keep you bound.
Mm-hmm.
Finn skipped the grief group, and that's why he's kicking over gravestones. And it's so interesting. I just reread both of these stories, and they're both just have such a place in my heart because Vale and Sage both the swirl of emotions and how fast it changes is just so true to what grief feels like and looks like, and I just love that so much about both of those books.
And Renee, I was wondering if you could talk more about the grief group. And I was especially struck by Sage and, in the beginning, her lack of generosity, I guess, or accepting her peers' loss as the same as her own, because it wasn't abrupt and the same level of tragedy in her mind. And why did you choose to include that? And could you share a little bit about the grief group in general? It was so relatable.
Yeah, I think so. It's important to show ways and to remind ourselves, the adults too, to remind ourselves that we have people. You may have lost your person and someone you love, but there's also so many people still here that care about you. So she's learning, I can have new friends and I can have new relationships and still love the person that's gone. And also, I don't have to compare my loss to your loss. It's okay for you to hold all that you're feeling, and I can hold all that I'm feeling, and we don't have to be like, I know how you feel, because you don't know how I feel. You didn't love my mama like I love my mama. So it's okay, but you can say, I care about you. I don't know how that feels, but I'm so sorry you're hurting. So she's learning that, I can care about people even if we haven't been through the same thing, even if they don't look like me, even if their grief shows up differently. I don't need to understand their pain. I can still be generous in my friendship with them. So, I think that's something we all struggle with. The first thing you want to say is, I understand how you feel. And I think it's okay to not understand how someone feels and to still say, but I love you and I care about you. So we in it together, even if I don't really get why you're so hurt or what the loss is for you. Yeah,
and I think in Vale's case, we saw her also, angry for very valid reasons. Like you said, she's dealing with both emotional loss and this physical pain. And you did a really great job weaving those together, but how did you balance a lot of pain, physical and emotional, with moments of levity? And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the balance that you managed to strike.
Yeah, I think sometimes it can be hard when we're grieving to allow ourselves to have those moments of joy. It can be really hard to have fun and think that's allowed and that's okay because, that might take away from my grief. And so for Vale, I really wanted her to still have those moments of joy, and it comes through in her friends, in her brother, who don't understand, like you said, what she's going through, but want to be in it with her. And so, for example, her best friend at school, she brings her old Nintendo Switch and is like, hey, you should check out this game called Dadish. It's really fun. You play a radish and you're just hopping from level to level. And her brother is like, come paint with me in the room together. And those are moments where it's not that she forgets what she's going through, but you get those glimpses of the Vale that she used to be with other people before her feelings sort of became the all-consuming thing that they are. And so I wanted to show those moments, not just so that you would have little breathers in the book, but also because it is really realistic. We can't be grieving 24/7, 100% of the time. There are going to be moments when it's not that you forget, but you let yourself think of other things. And so I really wanted to show her doing that.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on what my next question was going to be for all of you was, the importance of other people in our lives to help us through grief and to help us move forward. And you each have, well, several people in some cases, or one special person. I thought you could each pick one key character who helps your protagonist along, and why you chose them and how, whether it's a romantic interest or a coach or whoever it is who really helps, because I thought that was a beautiful addition to each story. Maybe Kate, you could be.
Yeah, so when Finn gets sent out to hike these 46 mountains, they arrange for him to have what he calls, with much disdain, trail nannies. These are experienced 46ers, people who have climbed all the high peaks, who are going to accompany him on each hike. And there are sort of 3 trail nannies who rotate. There's a woman who raised dairy farmers, who's actually modeled after my hiking partner, who is a dairy farmer in northern New York. There's a young guy who's a guidance counselor named Sam, who's, not really pressing Finn to share stories, but understands what he's going through and really gets the psychology of grief. And then there's an older guy who, when Finn meets him, he's like, this guy doesn't look like he could hike to the porta potty, much less up a mountain. And that's Coach, who turns out to have been Finn's father's hockey coach back in the day. And he becomes a very quiet mentor. He's not a guy who speaks a lot, and that is just fine for Finn, because Finn does not want to be chatting. He wants to get these mountains done. But he's this very quiet presence in his life. And sometimes you just need somebody to be there and be quiet. I think that's really part of grief too. And eventually, of course, he comes to understand what this kid's going through.
And consistent. I love that.
Yeah,
that
he's very steady.
Yeah,
he's very steady.
A steady force in his life. So Sage has a chorus of people too. She has a little crush. So she's learning that she can also find love and these new friends in her grief group. But really, I think Aunt Annie is her rock. So she learns from Aunt Annie, who's kind of like a grandmother role. She's the age of what a grandmother would be, but is technically her aunt. And she teaches Sage that, listen, I've been living for a really long time, and I can't count how many times I've laughed, and I can't count how many times I've cried, because there's been an abundance of both. And so she's helping Sage understand, I know you're only 13, so you don't know. You don't have 70 years of living. But let me tell you, there will be some days where you'll get to laugh again. You're going to survive this. You'll be okay. And that grief is like hunger. We eat today. I ate this morning, and you better believe I'm going to eat something later today. I'm going to eat tomorrow. I'm going to eat right? Because I will always have a need to feel that hunger. And so when you lose someone, you're never just going to stop missing them or stop grieving them. It's going to show up all the time for the rest of your life, and you can handle that. And so, Aunt Annie is trying to help her understand that in your 13-year-old self, I just want you to know there is a tomorrow, and there's a day after that, and a day after that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I think Valentina also has a lot of people around her, but I think the one who contributes the most to her journey is her friend Amanda, because like I said before, Valentina's whole life is fencing. And so all of her friends are her fencing buddies, and the adults around her are like her fencing coach, and her parents, who are very competitive alongside with her. And so having this friend that's in a completely different circle is really relieving for her, because she doesn't have to talk about fencing with her, and it's okay that her friend doesn't understand, because it just doesn't even come up, whereas when she's with her fencing friends, it's like all around her. She can't avoid the subject. And so it's really nice for her to be able to have this like safe space that has nothing to do with fencing, someone that she can talk to about just like random things. And it's the first time in her life that she's had a friend like that she can like talk about video games with, or like movies, or when she gets into salsa dancing, she even invites her over to dance too. And so just being able to have those people, I think, is so important. Sometimes we're in a bubble, and it takes like going out of that bubble to remind ourselves that there's more things out there.
That's great. So Kate, I know you managed to weave together two of the most traumatic moments in our nation's history, 9/11 and then the COVID-19 pandemic. And Finn is dealing with reconciling so many personal feelings while grappling with these big memories or big, you know, challenges in life. And I was wondering why you chose to put those together, and if you could talk a little bit about how you did that.
Sure. This book took a long time to come together, and it changed a lot. And I had started writing poems for this book when I first started hiking the Adirondack High Peaks back in 2015-16, and it was around 2017 when I realized I was writing a novel in verse, and I was like, But it took me a long time. I had this idea that I wanted to write about a kid who wasn't choosing to hike those mountains but had to. And then I had to ask, well, why would somebody have to hike mountains? Are the parents dragging them? Is this some sort of restitution? And I knew that Finn had lost somebody, but I was writing poetry for a long time without knowing exactly where that was going. And my writing for this really picked up in the months, after the COVID-19 pandemic began, and living through what we all did, that collective trauma. I feel like this is a book that just had to sort of soak in the world for a while for it to become what it needed to be. But the COVID-19 pandemic, in so many ways, the way it affected all of us collectively, and in so many different ways, really reminded me of the days following 9/11. And that was when I really realized that, Finn is grappling with a dad who was a hero. So Finn's father was a 9/11 firefighter who, and that all happened, of course, before this main character was born. But in this case, it's not a memory so much, Hannah, as like the shadow of what his dad did, and that he was on the front page of the newspaper, rescuing somebody from the North Tower, and he was always a hero. And yet at home, he wasn't a hero. He was struggling with PTSD. He wasn't always the greatest dad. He struggled with alcoholism. And how do you, as a 12-year-old kid who doesn't want to do the poetry project, reconcile that when this person that you don't even really understand died at a time when you didn't even get to mourn him appropriately, right, during the pandemic? And so that idea of grief that we feel when we're losing someone kind of plays together with this sort of collective grief that we all feel when something awful is happening in our country. And I think all that kind of melded together.
Yeah. And Renee, you brought this up earlier, the grief is hunger, and I wrote that down, that grief is like hunger, and at the same time that it is something that stays with you that you can't avoid. I found that I was craving cookies and ice cream and pastelitos while I was reading your books, and you all did a really good job of weaving in pleasure and the comfort of food and those moments, like not only as a break but as part of healing. And I thought I'd love to hear more about that. Maybe starting.
I mean, that's just been my experience. I've never had a day that is only sad or only amazing. A day, all right? Even in my best times, there's been something that maybe irritated me. I didn't like the way she said that. Or something that hurt my feelings. Or I got the phone call, that phone call, right? And then even in the deepest loss, I've lost my mother. I've lost someone who was like a second mother to me. I've lost a best friend that I grew up with all through middle school and high school. And so even in those deep, deep losses, there have been such graces, people showing up for me, people sending me letters and cards and text messages to check on me, right? So that's just what I know to be true, is that I am capable of experiencing all the feels all the time. And I just wanted young people to have that moment. So Sage is laughing. She's still dreaming. She has goals. She wants to be a pilot. She's going to get ice cream with her friends. She's still living, because that's what we do. I think we were made to survive. Humans were made to survive. So even when something hurts and is pulling at our hearts, there's something in us that still wants to rise. And so, I just wanted to be honest with young people and say, it's okay. I know you're hurting, and there will be moments where you're going to get to laugh too, and it's okay if that's both on the same day, because it is for us adults as well.
Yeah, and you had some of that in your stories too, Andrea.
Yeah, and I mean, again, same with like personal experience. I've lost my dad and 3 grandparents and a friend, and it's just, I find food to be very healing, and especially the foods that remind me of the people that I love. So I'm constantly like, oh, I'm missing my dad today. I'm going to make something that he used to make. And, tinkering with the recipes because it's not written down or, and so I like giving that sort of little food joy. It is a way that she connects with other people in the book, especially her rival, who's then not a rival. They bond over food a lot because I think food is a big connector for me personally, and so that trickles. It's easy for that to trickle into the stories we write.
Yeah. That's awesome. And then we see Finn making food, making cookies in particular.
Yeah, Finn always used to love to bake, and he's decided he's going to come up with a cookie recipe for every mountain that he climbs. And so some of the recipes are in the book too. And one of the things I loved about all of these books is that they don't. You would think that these would be heavy, weighty books, and yes, that weight is there, but also there's so much joy in both of them. In the salsa dancing and the Sage's the way she describes flying and the idea of being a pilot. And Finn, this story is funny, which is weird because it does deal with all. Somebody's like, I'm sorry, you wrote a funny book about a kid's dad who died and also 9/11 and COVID-19, but yeah, because. We have to laugh, right? I mean, we have to do that. That's why at funerals, there's always somebody cracking up over the Danishes. And we need that. There's such a fine line sometimes between laughter and tears. And we really need that. We need that release. My editor for this book also worked on another book of mine called The Seventh Wish, which also is sad and funny. And at the time, she said to me, when you write a sad book, that sad book also needs to be your funniest book because readers need both of those things. And that has stayed with me so long and was with me so much when I was working on this book, too.
And it's funny, right from the start, the first page made me laugh. So you definitely got that. And all of these books. Yes.
His personality, he's sarcastic and witty, and
yeah.
I love that. I feel like you're also showing you can still be you.
Yeah.
Just because you don't have to tone down your sense of humor because you're going through something hard. Yeah. So he gets to just be himself on the page, and I loved that about him too.
I loved it, and that's what my final question, and then I want to hear from all of you, is. The voices of your characters are all so strong. Like you fall in love with each of these characters and they feel so well defined and so fully realized, to use that publishing term. But, could you describe just for the audience, like what feeling you wanted your reader to take away from your character and their story? If you could just describe them as a person that, you would want to be friends with. Like, why do you want to know these characters? And you start a little bit about Finn. He's an angry, funny kid, but there's a lot more to him.
Yeah, I mean, he's snarky. Honestly, Finn, I taught middle school for 15 years. And so Finn is inspired by so many kids that I taught. And the guys who would come into my classroom being kind of jerky and kind of mean and a little bit snarky, I always wanted to know what was up with them because grief wears so many masks. And sometimes it looks like tears, which is what we expect. But sometimes it looks like the class clown, and sometimes it looks like snark, and sometimes it looks like that mean little comment. And I always, as a teacher, tried to remind myself to be curious what was underneath that. And that's very much the case with Finn. He is snarky, and it's always funny to me when I read reviews, which I try not to do, but sometimes I read them anyway. And people will call him unlikable.
Oh, no.
And I get that, right? He's kicking, in the very first time you meet him, he's kicking over a gravestone of some nice old lady he doesn't even know. So, okay. But also, there's always something underneath that. And Finn's voice showed up for me, like the voice showed up in poetry before I had any idea who he was. Like the snark was the first thing that showed up. And so I was like, well, that has to be there.
He's not unlikable at all. I completely disagree with that. So, yeah.
Sage, I think she's the kind of person that you can be in the same room with and neither of you have to say anything. And you've enjoyed your time with her, right? She's quiet. She's kind of, she's there. She's present with you. And there's a person that can just look you in your eyes and be like, I know, I got you. That's kind of how she is, I think, and what she needs of the people in her life. So yeah, she's quiet, but I think her presence is very heavy in the best way.
and so thoughtful.
Like you.
Yeah, she's thoughtful. I do. Yeah, she's very
Perspective.
thoughtful. A lot of why a part of her grief is the worry. Was I a good friend? Did she know how much I actually loved her? And so, yeah, she wants to make sure that the people who she loves, that they know. Yeah.
That was one of the most touching parts of the story, that anxiety she was feeling. Yeah. And finally, Valentina?
Vale has also been called unlikable. People don't like how much she rejects the help of others and how single-minded she is. But I think that's so realistic. And I was a middle school teacher as well. And I had so many students who would walk in after their third soccer concussion, ready to go back to training the next day because their dream that they had in their head for themselves was, I'm going to be a professional soccer player. And they just couldn't let go of that. And so I really wanted to create a character that felt true to that, because I think we've all been that person at some point where we've held on to something longer than we know we should be holding on to it, because we can't accept that it's okay to pivot on dreams, that they don't have to be permanent. We put so much pressure on ourselves and on the people around us, and especially on young people, to kind of pick something and stick to it, and to quit something is really bad. But sometimes you need to quit or pivot or change or, find a different way of doing things. And so I like to think that Vale is reminding people a little bit of themselves when they read her, but also of other people they've known, because we've all either been a Vale or know a Vale. And I hope, because I do that a lot with my characters, that if you read my books, you will be more empathetic to yourself and to other people when you find yourself having those conversations about what's okay or what's allowed to do.
Absolutely. I'm sorry we are out of time, but thank you for this beautiful conversation. If anyone has questions, we have 2 microphones on either end of the room. Please come up. All right. Thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
So I have one that's not a question, but just a statement for Renee. So I teach 2nd grade, and we read last year Born in the Water, and I just wanted to say that it's such an honor to be here in your presence, and I cannot wait to go back to my school and be like, oh my God, guess what, guys?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that so much.
But the actual question I had was for the teachers. So I just wanted to know if teaching middle school, kind of pigeonholed your experience with writing kids. So like I said, I teach 2nd grade, but the protagonist of my current work in progress is a middle schooler. She's a 6th grader. Do you feel like your experience in education kind of would prohibit you from writing kids in other ages, or do you feel like it's kind of all encompassing?
I can take that. I write across age groups, so I write picture books and easy readers and chapter books about 2nd and 3rd graders. And I certainly have a strong 10 to 12-year-old voice in my head from my teaching. I mean, when you teach, I taught for 15 years. I've got the voices of 1,000 12-year-olds in my head still, because I loved those kids. And it certainly is helpful when you're writing that age group, but I spend a lot of time around kids of all ages, like when I do school visits and things. And I don't feel like it pigeonholes me. No, and it shouldn't pigeonhole you.
Yeah, I would second that. I taught middle school specifically. I've only published middle grade so far, but I do think the most important thing is to just be around young people of all ages. I fostered teenagers for a long time, and so I got to be around all sorts of really cool teenagers with very different personalities, even though I never taught them in a school setting. And I've been around the kids of my friends, or so I think it is good to be around kids, because we learn best by listening, period. But yeah, you can definitely write any category. I don't think you're limited to what you have the most experience in.
Thank you.
Right. We don't have any other questions. I do have one more. Okay, so I'll take up the rest of our time. Oh, no, okay. You win.
Hi, thank you so much for writing these books, for being who you are. I'm a clinical social worker. I work a lot with trauma and grief, and I so appreciate that you're talking about the different kinds of loss, of course, the concrete losses as well as the ambiguous loss of identity, all the blues, what a beautiful way to put that, as well as sort of the omnilectic of life, not just the either or, but the both and of every day and the whole perspective. And a quick side note, I was a sophomore in college for 9/11, and I remember sitting there in the collectortron being so upset about all the children and what they were going through with losses of parents. And then fast forward 2 years ago when I was a professor, and when we were talking about trauma, and one of my students mentioned that she had lost her father as a firefighter in the Twin Towers. And I thought, wow, like, you know, it took 22 years and a doctorate degree, but now is my opportunity to help, you know, one of those children. And so that whole idea, it sounds like you all speak to, that grief evolves, you know. But in my work, what I see so much with children is that unfortunately they're dismissed as not needing help because somehow they're told they're simultaneously too immature to understand what's going on and also somehow too resilient to need help. You know, oh, kids are resilient, they just handle all these things. And with COVID in particular, what we've seen a lot in my field is that the idea that, well, everybody went through it. And I always say, well, all kids' experiences were very different, and also just because everyone went through it doesn't mean nobody went through it. So in your work, what have you noted that, what needs are overlooked when it comes to grief with children, and what strengths are also overlooked with kids?
I will say that I sometimes see a resistance to share books, to share sad stories with teachers, from teachers and librarians and parents too, sometimes caregivers, to share sad stories with kids. And the thought is that we want to protect them from things, right? Like we don't want them to have to experience sadness. And I was like, I have a bulletin for you, right? Like the likelihood of any child making it to adulthood untouched by grief is just minuscule. And I had a teacher mention to me, or librarian, say, "Oh, I liked your book. It's just there's too many sad books right now. Like there's too many of them." And I was like, "Do you know how many children lost caregivers to COVID-19? The number is 10 million. They deserve stories. They need stories. We need to show them that we see them and that all of these different ways of grieving and processing and acting up and acting out and laughing and caring and eating, all of that is okay."
I would like us to ask more questions of our young people and really listen, right? So I don't want to project onto a child, you must be feeling really sad about this, and so I'm going to do this for you. But I want to know, how are you feeling about what's happening in our world? How are you feeling about what happened in our city? How do you feel about missing grandma? Do you know what I mean? So then they'll tell you. I really believe young people will answer the questions if we ask them. So then we just have to be better listeners and do something with the information we're collecting and make space for them to honor the people that they've lost and to honor their very real feelings of loss, whether that's loss of a person or of something that's more intangible. Helping them process that, I think, is important.
Yeah, and adding on, I think it can be hard. It's great when caregivers and adults around them ask those questions, but obviously not every kid has people in their life asking those questions. And so I think that's why these books are so important, because they model for you how to have those conversations with your peers and with the adults in your life, especially depending what you're watching on TV or in the movies. Sometimes those conversations are shown in media as being so dramatic and kind of toxic. And so it's nice to have books where people can talk about their feelings in like respectful, healthy ways. I think it's really important for young people to see that in books because they might not have examples of that in their real life.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, I lost my brother, and I can't wait to read your books, and I'm so glad that you wrote about grief.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
I am so sorry that happened to you, and I'm so happy you're here. Thank you for trusting us enough to come talk with us today.
Hi. So other than Finn, Sage, and Valley, who is your favorite character in the book? And why? And have you thought about, I mean, obviously these are all standalone middle grade. Have you ever thought about, or as you were writing, get distracted, like, oh, I might go in a different direction and write about this character instead? I'll leave that to you.
Oh, that's a good one.
That's a great question.
I think for me, my favorite character is Vale's rival, Mirka, because it's very much a one-sided rivalry. Like, Valentina thinks they are enemies, but it's really all in her head. And so it was so much fun to write their scenes together, where Mirka is genuinely trying to be a friend to Vale, and Vale is like, no, we must destroy each other. Honestly, I put that whole dynamic in the book just because it brought me joy. And I had to remember, like, there were other more overarching kind of things happening. But for me, that was the most fun to write. I really enjoyed their dynamic.
So might we get Mirka's story someday?
Maybe, who knows?
I want her brother too, please.
I did love writing the brother character. He's an improved version of myself.
Oh my goodness. I think Sage has a crush on someone, and I really like how he shows up for her. And I don't know that oftentimes books for young people make the guy love interest be a certain kind of way, and I wanted to avoid that at all costs. He's very sensitive, thoughtful, and listens to her. And so I really like him. I really like him a lot. And it made me want to write some love stories.
Yeah.
Finn's honestly my favorite. So other than Finn, he has a couple friends from school that if I ever did want to write a companion book, I would do a lot more with them, but mostly Finn.
All right. Do we have time for one? Okay. Okay, one last question. Quick, we'll keep it really fast.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Deandra. I'm a Howard student. I'm so glad that I got to be here to sit at this panel and just listen to you all talk about your books. I'm really grateful, and I wanted to give you all your props because I know writing a story is just congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, but during the summer, I was educating students that were going from the 5th grade to the 6th grade, and we read a book written by Jason Reynolds. I just wanted to make a comment. So sorry. In our program, we learned that behavior is communication. So when I heard you talking about people criticizing Finn and having different comments regarding his character, that kind of made me think of that. I guess as an educator, I just wanted to know how. I'm so sorry. When it comes to facing grief, do you think it's important that educators, how do you think we should navigate those conversations with our students? I know we have different students that come from different walks of life, and we don't always know what's going on at home, but I guess with the way that the world is going, the amount of change can be so scary. So I'm wondering, what your perspective is on that.
So I was a teacher as well. I taught for many, many years as a teaching artist and creative arts therapy. You are teachers. You are not therapists. So I really think it's okay to not take on the burden of then processing grief with your students. But I think it's very simple at the beginning of a class to say, I know a lot is happening in our world, young people. Today we're here to do math, but I just want to acknowledge that I see you. If you have questions, if you need to talk to someone, here's some resource. You know what I mean? Just be human in the classroom. Bring books that they can relate to, and most of our books have study guides or questions to help you teach them in the classroom, so use that as a resource. I don't know that it's so much of what you do in the curriculum with grief as much as it is acknowledging that you are allowed to bring your whole self to my classroom. Right? I'm not going to say leave your personal life at the door. I'm going to say, if you want to write a poem that honors your grandmother or someone who's no longer with us or all the ways that you've changed, we can write that poem, right? So that's what I hope that teachers do. What shade of blue are you feeling today? Raise your hand if you're bright blue. Raise your hand if you're feeling stormy blue. So you just get a sense of what's in the classroom, and then you can adjust, But yeah, you're not a therapist. You all have so much that you have to do in the classrooms already. So I think it's okay to be the teacher, but also to be human.
I love what you said. Yeah, I love what you said too about behavior is communication, and I think that's such a big part of it. When I taught 7th grade, any kid you can see when your kids show up and they're not feeling right? Because you've got that kid who's super snarky or mouthy or a little bit mean, and the first thing I would do when that happened is just back up and give them a little space, because I feel like too often the adult impulse is to, that's not how you talk to me, and that just escalates everything. Whereas if you give them a little bit of space and then maybe a few minutes later just kind of kneel down and say, "You doing okay today?" It's a very disarming question for someone who wants to make you mad. And it's communication, right? That behavior is communication, and if you hear it and respond to it in kind, you care about your students so much, like I can tell from your question, and that's so much of the battle, I think.
And I think too, sometimes it can be really hard for students to have those personal conversations, especially if they're not used to having them. But if you use a book or a TV show or a movie, like how they talk about those characters can be so telling about what they're going through in their lives. And I didn't really realize it until this panel, but all 3 of my books are about grief, apparently. And the amount of adults I have who have come up to me and been like, Buddy read this book with a young person in my life, and then we talked about what the character was going through, and then ended up having conversations that I didn't know how to have before. Yeah. So I think leaning on whatever materials you already have in your classroom or whatever they're enjoying at home, and kind of using that as we're not talking about personal stuff unless you want to, kind of, that can be helpful too.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you all for insight.